Hello and welcome to BT Brainstorm. I'm Abha Bakaya, and today we dive into an issue that's really been taking the BT 500 by storm. This is one of the big stories in our current special issue, BT 500. And to discuss this in detail, I have with me Saurav Majumdar, the editor of Business Today magazine, joining us from our Mumbai studio, along with Krishna Gopalan, deputy editor of Business Today magazine. Our guest today, Sriram Subramaniam, founder and MD in Govern Research Services; Neeraj Grover, also with us, assistant professor, Azim Premji University; Sumit Agrawal, managing partner at Regstreet Law Advisors; and Sudeep Mahapatra is also with us, partner, SNR Associates. Gentlemen, what a fabulous panel, and great to have you all with us here on the show today. Saurav, let me kickstart by really setting the context. We've all been very aware of some of the very high-profile cases that have come to light, but there must be so many more below the surface that are gripping shareholders across the Indian marketplace. Tell us why you chose to do this story in the BT 500 issue.
Yeah, thanks, Abha. Actually, this is the very reason why we decided to do it. There are so many cases now which have come to the forefront about shareholders now beginning to really assert themselves and, forcing managements to get back to the drawing board on several resolutions, including typically remuneration. And, we've seen this as a growing trend. And let me tell you that nobody is really out of bounds. Some of the biggest companies, some of the best known CEOs, some of the biggest entrepreneurs are now being forced to reassess the kind of the plans which they've brought forward to shareholders. And I think that trend is increasing over time. And there are a couple of reasons, quite a few reasons, in fact, which it is because of. And we will go into those reasons during the course of this discussion, I'm sure. But it is a growing trend, and which is why we thought there was no better issue to actually take stock of, rather than the BT 500, which is actually a compendium of India's most valuable companies. So here we wanted to take stock of how these valuable companies, and many of these companies, are taking stock of this new growing phenomenon of shareholder activism.
Absolutely. So let's bring in our guests on this and understand why now. Let me start with you, Sumit, and get a sense of the rising activism we're seeing. How new is this to India, to India's most valuable companies? We know that promoters have been really facing the brunt of it. They're not able to just wing it anymore. There has been a lot of scrutiny. What's led to this evolution?
Thank you, Abha. I agree with Saurabh that there is an increase in shareholder activism. But when we see, this has been largely in this decade, especially when there was an entire change in legal regime and Companies Act 1956 got changed to Companies Act 2013. There, the provisions were strengthened to provide special rights to the shareholders, including to the minority shareholders. Now, while India has not seen many cases regarding the class action suits, however, for operation mismanagement or for seeking the responsibility of the management or even to the promoters to that extent, whether in the context of National Company Law Tribunal or SEBI or even in the context of Competition Commission, a large number of litigations have come to fore, including the rise of proxy advisors. Now you have a specialist proxy advisory firms which provide their opinions or the recommendations which are taken into considerations for voting by the institutional shareholders. So gone are the days where minority shareholders or the shareholders could be taken for a ride, and the regulator as well as the judiciary taking a tough stand for the cases of non-disclosures has given a boost to the shareholders to come and enforce the law as it is. In fact, just to add, India has even seen cases where in the context of, say, delisting, where the litigation went from SEBI to SAT to Supreme Court, and Securities Appellate Tribunal, in fact, even said that the children, the minority shareholders or the shareholders are not the children of the lesser God. So therefore, please take them seriously. While the matter is still sub judice, but these are the growing trend which India is seeing, which perhaps in the last decade, India had never seen this.
Krishna, you want to come in here as well?
Yes, my understanding, at least going on the basis of the story and the in-depth reporting we got into, it was just stunning to realize how even some of the large companies have not been spared. So it doesn't matter what the size is, the moment you're a minority shareholder, I think the biggest source of comfort is your voice can be heard and your voice will matter. So these two things stand out in my mind as being the key takeaways from the reporting point of view is concerned. As we've jokingly mentioned in the story, you start with a letter of the alphabet, you will find a company in the middle of that kind of a crisis. So it doesn't matter which industry you're in, how large the promoter holding is, if an issue is raised, and if the shareholder has a problem with it, they demand a certain level of clarity by way of an answer from the company, which I think is most fascinating from my point of view.
So, Sriram, give us a sense of whether or not this is actually being implemented effectively. As Krishna mentioned, we did a detailed look in the magazine at some of the changes in corporate governance and the kind of scrutiny that's currently being put onto certain practices. But are there loopholes? Is there a way that companies aren't necessarily implementing all of the suggested practices? What's really being seen on ground?
Good afternoon. Firstly, thanks for having me on this forum, and it's a privilege. If you look at the practice, companies used to take minority shareholders for a ride. So one needs to look at what is currently the shareholding of companies. So that matters to a large extent. If the promoter stake is 75% or it is lower than 50%, etc. What is the shareholding of the institutional shareholders? What is the shareholding of the foreign institutional shareholders? All these come to the fore because that is where it impacts the thinking of the promoters and the management of the company. Two is the nature of issues, of course, has changed and evolved over a period of time. Initially, large M&A kind of transactions or capital restructuring kind of transactions used to be under large scrutiny. Now, even director appointments, CEO compensations, auditor appointments have become much more come to the fore. Okay, slowly we'll also move to a regime where the corporate performance in terms of profitability, in terms of growth, in terms of stock price performance, etc., will also start attracting activist shareholders. We still aren't there yet, but we are evolving to understand many of these issues. And just to complete and dwelling on any loopholes as such, see, obviously, it is still a long way to go, right? I mean, where right now managements can take, especially in the Z case, Dish TV case, etc., there have been how the management has pushed back now, taking the investors to court or doing tactics which are outside of the purview of, I would say, corporate democracy in some way. So we need to see how the landscape evolves. Courts have a sort of a overreaching this one in India, and court matters tend to get delayed. So that's where I think one needs to see whether we can resolve court matters quite fast and I would say fairly.
Saurav?
Yeah, I think, I wanted to ask Sriram and the panelists here one question, is that what is the reason why this is, taking, is the emergence of proxy advisory firms also one key reason? Now that shareholders realize that they have somebody who can really, advise them, guide them, and, make sense of some of the complicated resolutions which are often put forward. Is that one of the key reasons which is driving this whole trend now?
Thanks for asking that question. Obviously, I would like to think at least that's one reason for sure, but there are other reasons too. I mean, since February 2010, when SEBI mandated the domestic mutual funds disclose, first of all, have a voting policy, and second, disclose how they vote at shareholder meetings. That sort of, I would say, is the moment of reckoning for domestic mutual funds from a voting perspective. Then subsequently, SEBI has continuously pushed the institutional investors to vote. As recent as last year, they have made it again mandatory for portfolio managers and AIFs to vote. And now this year, in fact, they are asserting that mutual funds should not abstain from voting. They should definitely have either a for or against vote. Okay, and they should definitely vote on all the resolutions. So the regulator definitely has played a part on the same. Similarly, IRDA and the PFRDA have pushed their institutional investors, that is the insurance companies and the pension funds, to vote. And all these institutional investors are now signatories to a stewardship code. So that has evolved in India. And of course, as Sumit said, the new Companies Act of 2013 also enabled or empowered minority shareholders. So all these factors have sort of contributed to this evolution.
All right. Let me also bring Neeraj in. Neeraj, why don't you also...
I mean, just to add to what Sriram is saying.
Sure, please go ahead.
No, just to add to what Sriram was saying. So we've always had some sort of shareholder activism, but it's always been the small retail guy making noise at an AGM or an EGM or sending letters to SEBI. Now, what has changed, and these are the two factors that I think the panelists brought out. One is there's a lot more research thanks to the proxy firm which is out there, which is far more sophisticated than what we've seen in the past. And secondly, the rise of the institutional investors. Now, if you look at what Sumit was talking about, oppression and mismanagement. But what happens with an institutional investor is that he has the resources to fight that battle. An Investco can get the top counsels to come into court and take on a Z-board, which earlier the small retail guy could not. So the rise of institutional investors who have the ability to get the top lawyers, the top PR firms, has also changed the game, because now you have people with significant resources and ability to actually run a very successful campaign, which we've seen over the last decade. So those two factors, I think, has seen this more high-profile type of shareholder activism that we are referring to. India's had a long history, but it's just, this is much more sophisticated, much more prominent, which is why it's now sort of getting more eyeballs.
Okay. Okay, Neeraj, let me also bring you in and get your perspective on this, and also where we are vis-a-vis developed, countries when it comes to shareholder activism.
Thanks, Abha. Very interesting points. I think shareholder activism is a complex topic. I imagine that when you refer to activism, a peculiarity of Indian condition is that we are not just talking about activism against the management, but also against other shareholders. And that makes it all the more difficult to be an activist shareholder in such a landscape. So I think two things have happened. One is, of course, law has gone a step ahead, and that's been duly noted. However, the second, and I think the more important factor behind these recent incidents, have been the changing landscape of who these shareholders are. But I would still not be entirely optimistic about this as of yet. Another reason being that shareholder apathy has been a long-noted problem. Institutional investors simply have no incentive to go ahead and act as an activist shareholder, but they simply fall back on market metrics and rely on that to justify their roles. But with the stewardship codes and with a more connected global finance, all that is changing. So not only are we creating indigenous solutions to shareholder apathy, but we're also seeing an influence from what's happening abroad in these stewardship codes. And that, to me, is an important factor. It's beautiful how developments in other countries in terms of pushing shareholders in companies to act is creating an influence here. But my reservation, and this is my last point here, is that I worry if this will create a market inequality of a different kind. Okay. I worry if this will take us back to a place where there are few activist shareholders who then become so the more prominent that it creates further complications of fighting. Earlier you were fighting promoters, and now you will fight these activist shareholders with more resources at their hand. I worry for the traditional mom and pop investor who will be left behind in this race to activism. And that's all I have for now.
That's really interesting, actually. Sriram, let me come back to you on that and also get Sumit and Neeraj in for their comments. Do you see that happening? Is that a possibility? Because till now we've only been crying about the minority shareholder not getting a voice. But do you see it perhaps playing out in different ways as well as we've just seen suggested? Sriram?
So definitely, see, as Indian corporate scenario evolves from a promoter-led to, I would say, a widely held, where the promoter shareholding goes down, there are bound to be various factions of shareholders, be it even various facets of institutional shareholders itself. So there is bound to be differences of opinions and differences of views, and there is going to be battles out there in the future. And come to think of it, this new age of companies which are getting listed, which are VC funded, etc. So if you see, there is no one single promoter out there, and so that is going to be a new class of companies that will evolve and will have its own set of issues. So definitely there is bound to be various facets of, I would say, conflicts of interest and fights among various sets of shareholders.
Sudeep, let me come to you on this, that it's really remuneration, of course, has taken center stage. Is that just because those are very high profile cases? What would you say are the biggest issues that come up when it comes to activism? What are we seeing? We also know, of course, you've all mentioned the Invesco example. That's clearly one that's been very much in the news. But where else are we really seeing some of these issues crop up?
So remuneration is, I think, been the flavor of the season, but I expect, as in the coming years, this will expand to much more than just remuneration. I think appointment of directors is going to become another area where we will see a lot more sort of activist, action, mergers, acquisitions, related party transactions. These are all things which are now on activist radars, and where you will see, I think, more and more sort of activist interventions. Remuneration has obviously caught the, grabbed the headlines in recent times, but I think you will see in the coming years that this will expand into different areas of corporate governance and not just stop at remuneration.
I had an interesting question which was asked of me by some of the CEOs which we've been speaking to for the story and otherwise. While this is a very good trend, I mean, people asking questions, smaller shareholders getting their due, forcing managements to rethink and all of that. Is there a danger, however, that some of this may actually go overboard and become needlessly combative between the shareholders and the managements, and therefore forcing managements to sort of backtrack on strategically important decisions? Now, is there a danger of this going overboard?
Neeraj, Sumit? Yeah, Sumit, go ahead.
The way I see it is, and I'll take what Sudeep said further, that in the times to come, we are going to see not only regarding the appointment or the compensation, but including on the cases relating to, say, takeovers, relating to delisting or restructuring. And we have seen some of the indicators. For instance, we had seen not only in Eicher Motors, we had seen, in fact, the former SEBI chairman, his reappointment in Vedanta, or Mr. Rao being his compensation in Infosys, or Mr. Deepak Parekh himself being reappointed in HDFC in 2018.
Sure.
We, in fact, even see the cases like Apollo Tyres or Alacarjo Logistics. So such examples are only indicative of the facts that in the coming years, there are so many such noises which are going to be made. But it also requires two pointers to be taken into consideration, which is, one, today, in fact, in the initial stages itself, India is also seeing where complaints are being launched against the proxy advisors at the door of the regulator.
Okay.
Second, how do you protect a shareholder against the retaliation being made by the company or its management? These are some of the issues I think India still doesn't have an answer And somewhere in the times to come, if we are talking about shareholder democracy, this has to be taken into consideration.
Okay. So,
no, just to add to that.
And look, there will always be some cases of abuse and misuse, right?
This has got everyone going. So go ahead, Neeraj. You was sorry. I think it was Sudeep and Sriram. Sriram, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily see it as always a conflict I mean, management and shareholders at two ends of the spectrum, right? I mean, there is positive engagement also. There could be definitely there is better outcomes now. I see that, in fact, interactions with independent directors of many of the boards tell that there is deeper analysis, there is deeper involvement of the independent directors in the affairs of the company, etc. So no longer, in fact, are many of these abusive transactions or proposals coming up to even the board or the shareholders. In fact, because of this focus and the demand from the board, so what has happened is many of the things that could have been taken for granted in the past is no longer coming out, or rather not being done. Transactions, be it related party transactions, be it other cases, etc., where the promoter sort of thought of the 100% of the cash flows to be their cash flows and completely roughshod minority shareholders. Even if large companies, that used to happen in the past, but no longer can they afford to do that. So I think this should be seen in such a context that there is a positive environment and it enhances the corporate governance of the whole capital markets in the country. And because of that, there is an enhanced trust. And because of that, there is more capital that comes to the capital markets.
Interesting. Actually, you've hit on a really important point there, and I want to take that forward with whoever would like to jump in, because, you know, while on one hand we've had shareholders crying foul about, you know, or promoter shareholders crying foul about that increased scrutiny and how it's unfair, especially when it comes to remuneration, one can consider that as fairly entitled also, you know, when one thinks about the minority shareholder who's really just worried about the kind of money that they're putting in and wanting to be a lot more involved. The trading economy, you know, the traders really here in the Indian markets have also, you know, seen a huge jump, especially over the last year or so. And the number of people that are getting into the markets is exponential. So from that point of view, would it be fair to say that the time when perhaps promoters could take those unilateral calls or convince people of their view is now well past us, and going forward, we're really entering into a new era now?
Abha, I wanted to put in another aspect to this whole discussion. You know, while we are focusing on obviously the larger companies, the better known ones, and there are many others. I mean, let's say the BT top 500, for instance. Okay, now you have these companies where a lot of this discussion is happening. There is a huge number of mid-size and smaller companies.
Exactly.
I'm not sure how much of activism is actually happening. I mean, taking off from the point which you mentioned about newer shareholders coming in, newer investors coming in into the market, and many of these so-called multi-baggers which are sort of hitting new highs in the smaller and, you know, even smaller size companies, very small companies. I mean, there are shareholders there too. Are they raising enough voices? Are the proxy investors, proxy advisors looking at them? Are institutions looking at them? We would like to know what's going on in that space as well, you know.
Absolutely. Who would like to jump in?
Yeah,
I mean, because it is for proxy advisory firms itself directly to us. I mean, see, obviously, we will go where the investors are, right? I mean, at the end of the day, and that is fair to us, where the issues are. I mean, be it a 100 crore market cap company or a 500 crore market cap company, if an investor is there and seeking some redressal, we will definitely help. So that is the response. We, in fact, this year have worked on a couple of cases where very activist shareholders in just a 500 crore market cap kind of a company, we have helped such a shareholder. But of course, the outcomes, I mean, media doesn't cover it. Those kind of issues are there. That's a different matter altogether.
And that's just the big question. Are we headed in for a more systemic change altogether? Is this just a series of high-profile cases, or is this something that's a change that's here to stay and in favor of the minority shareholder and in favor of the rising interest in India's stock markets? Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Great to have all of you with us, sharing your perspective, your experiences and insight. Saurav, Krishna, thanks so much for being part of this conversation. And of course, do take a closer look at the BT 500 issue for an in-depth look at the story and all the various angles to it. That's all from us on BT Brainstorm. Thanks for watching.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.